All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us as always at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Happy to be joined once again today by former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Thanks so much for taking the time to come to us today, all the way from Rome, Mr. Speaker. Really appreciate it.
It's always great to be with you, and I read your material constantly, and I think it's a remarkable achievement.
I want to talk to you a little bit about, obviously, the situation here politically. There's a lot of different questions to get to on that front. But before we do, you were kind enough to participate in a series of pieces that we have running at the Federalist starting in the past week, and it's going to run through December 21st, the 400th anniversary of Plymouth Rock. On what we're calling the 1620 Project, essentially an appreciation of the essential nature of the Pilgrims to America, to what makes the country great, and to eventually our founding. This is not meant to just be a rebuttal to the 1619 Project, because it's obviously a different focus, but that is part of it as well. And you were kind enough to participate in it. Tell me a little bit, just given the context of this 400-year anniversary, this unique opportunity to look back at what happened in terms of the nation's founding period, what the importance of the Pilgrims ought to be to Americans today in what is a very weird Thanksgiving year.
Well, in some ways, the very weirdness of this year is a pretty good reminder of why the emergence of the Pilgrims, and then after them the Puritans, and then ultimately the whole rise of the English and Scottish Enlightenment is so central to what's happening. I mean, we've watched this year a repudiation of the American Constitution on a scale that's breathtaking, where local politicians decide that you don't have a right to assemble, you don't have a right of free speech, you don't have a right to worship, and they do it on a totally random and personalistic basis of what they like. So casinos can open, but churches can't. Bars can or cannot open. And all this is being done by the essence of political power, which is the idea that if you hold office, you become a mini god and you get to define reality. Well, what happened starting, and the reason that 1620 and the follow-on in New England is so important, they ultimately defined the uniqueness that our rights come from God, and that if you go back and look at the Mayflower Compact and look at other writings, they repudiated at a very early stage the very idea that a king could be a tyrant. And they were able to sit out the English Civil War because they were in America and not in England. But the underlying fight in the English Civil War is a question of whether the king is totally sovereign and do whatever he wants to, or the king is subordinate to the parliament and the rule of law. And that's then compounded by Cromwell's dictatorship, which permanently imprints for several hundred years that you do not want politicians to have power without restriction. And so that's the essence of the American model, which is that your rights come to you from God. Government is by definition limited. And the Constitution was written to limit government rather than to limit individuals. The founding fathers recognized that in a world that's very dangerous, you have to have a government. They would have thought things like the various defund the police movements were signs of utter irrationality because they deny the reality of criminals. And similarly, they would have said the idea you could have a weak federal government is a denial of reality because Britain or France or Spain will eat you up and will eliminate you as a country. So they had to have a government strong enough to defend them, but they didn't want a government that could then oppress them. Well, that entire model, which is at the heart of the American system, comes starting in 1620. And ironically, slavery, which is an enormous defect in the American system, although it's also a defect worldwide at that time, and not a peculiarly American situation. Slavery is really defined against this backdrop of freedom. So if you think of the larger American story as an exceptionalism based on our rights coming from God, then it's very important, and I do think those who are concerned about the African American experience have a legitimate argument that we should pay more attention to it. We should realize how totally central it is to the African American experience and how significantly central it is to many whites. But it's a subset of the larger American story. And part of what makes it so uniquely American is that it is, in fact, a violation of our core beliefs, and therefore, over time, has to be fixed. And over time, in fact, thousands of people died trying to fix it. And I think that in that sense, it's a profound mistake to think that 1619 and slavery defines America more, because it doesn't define America any more than it defines any other country that had slavery in the same period. What defined America was this extraordinary break with the right of divine rule and the assertion that you and I and every single one of us is endowed by God with liberty, and that liberty cannot be taken away by government. So I just think in that sense that one of the tragedies of the modern left is that in their hatred of America, they have to keep inventing mythologies that aren't true.
The thing that's interesting to me about one of the points you brought up is I've always viewed the Pilgrims as having this unique combination of audacity, faith, foolishness, and bravery that is kind of a hallmark of Americans over the years who achieved great things. That you have to have a little bit of that crazy about what you're willing to engage in order to go off across the sea and in the way that they did, and to have that boldness in order to stick to it, even as things seem to be crumbling around you and people are dying left and right. I mean, after the Mayflower Compact is signed, by the end of the next winter, they've lost half of their people. I mean, it's a terrible, circumstance that they go through, but their ability to come out of it and to stick in the way that they did, and ultimately, as you say, the Puritans coming afterward, it seemed to me that this is such an innate part of America that I worry is being lost. And the reason that I worry it's being lost is because we look across the country, right now, and there are politicians, the governor of Oregon, for instance, literally calling on Americans to act as narcs, to snitch on their neighbors who are gathering in household gatherings that, by the way, the New York Times could admit it now that the election is over, have not actually been connected with a huge surge in the way that many inaccurate press reports initially led. This is the sort of thing that I think is very un-American. It seems very out of character with who I think of us as a people, to kind of to snitch on your neighbors and narc on them for trying to gather together as families, as they are free to do. Is there something that the left has successfully taken out of the American character that is indicated by that type of thing? Or do you think that that's still kind of a very small part of the American experience, one that is more an exception that proves the rule that most Americans aren't like that?
Well, I'm not sure I accept the binary quality of the question. First of all, I think what the governor of Oregon is doing is remarkably like the Stasi in East Germany, and the whole notion that your neighbors should spy on you, and such a profound deviance from the American tradition, but at the same time, so it fits so perfectly into the left's need to coerce everybody. Where the right, frankly, has a hard time getting organized because it believes so passionately that every individual should go do their own thing. Uh, the left has an enormous, almost muskox herd requirement that everybody has to be in the herd, and whatever level of pain is needed to get them back into the herd is a matter of survival. Because if the herd is actually allowed to think on its own, it will no longer be a herd. And therefore, this is really what Orwell's all about in his novel, 1984, in Animal House, and is really what Hayek is warning about in The Road to Serfdom. So the governor of Oregon is creating Oregonian serfs. And ironically, it tells you a lot about how insane it is that she has never asked people to report on the Antifa protesters who are destroying downtown Portland, because that would, of course, be an inappropriate anti-left gesture. So I do think we're in a great cultural civil war, and I don't think we know how the story will end. We seem to attract more people with courage than the left seems to be able to coerce. And that includes, frankly, people who come from overseas. I thought it was wonderful that a Ukrainian woman won a Republican congressional seat in Indiana. And part of her battle cry was, "I have seen socialism, and I can tell you it doesn't work." But just as we had two Cuban Americans win Republican seats in Miami under a very similar battle cry. So I think there's turmoil. I think had Trump been reelected, that the momentum was there to really dramatically change and take on the left. I think with Trump's defeat in a very strange election, but in a setting where the Republicans gained in the House, gained in the state legislature, gained in governorships, probably will end up in control of the Senate. We're sort of, it's a little bit like the period around Gettysburg, in the Civil War. The other side may or may not have won at the very top, and they may or may not have had to cheat to do it, but they sure didn't win anywhere below. In fact, my newsletter next week is going to be on how the red tide submerged the blue wave, because I've just been amazed at how many seats we picked up all over the country. So I think there's a genuine deep fight underway. And my guess is that the very arbitrary stupidity of these left-wing governors will increase the anti-government hostility of an amazing number of Americans.
You mentioned the strangeness of this election. I think that a lot of people would agree with you. The fact is that I think many people, particularly those in the Democrat media corporate establishment, were expecting and eager for a total swamping of not just President Trump, but Trumpism itself. And in other words, the idea that the party of Donald Trump needed to be defeated, needed to be rebutted and punished. And obviously they didn't get that. They didn't get anything like that. Instead, you end up with a very narrow, incredibly narrow electoral college defeat for the president, at the same time that you see, as you said, this red tide resulting in outcomes that literally no professional analyst was predicting in the media corporate establishment. You didn't have a single person saying that Republicans would pick up the kind of seats that they picked up in the House. Democrats have invested enormous resources in winning over these state legislatures, and going into a redistricting year became all the more critical, and yet the opposite happened. In terms of telling the story of this election, what do you think the overall story is that ended up with this result? People like to have simplistic views of elections that are narratively easy but don't actually deal with the complexity. The satisfactory one for a lot of folks in the media was Hillary Clinton is just really unpopular. Like, that's the kind of thing that they ran with last time around, which is true, but ignores all of the things that would require them to deal with the reality of the distance between them and the nation. What's the story of the 2020 election from your perspective?
Well, it's a tall order. The I would say, first of all, that at the presidential level, this may be the most corrupt election since 1824, when John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay combined to steal the presidency from Andrew Jackson. The reason I say that is you've had at least 93% hostility in the corporate media. You've had the internet companies actively, openly biased against and censoring the Republicans. Rush Limbaugh has 4 out of 6 tweets censored one day. There's a level of anti-populism that is astonishing. You had Zuckerberg put in $400 million into a clearly one-sided turn out the Democratic vote model that was pretty astonishing. When you look at the totality of it, combined with the behavior of the FBI, et cetera, you have to conclude that the Trump presidency had more deliberate, a hurricane full of headwind trying to destroy it for 5 years, starting in 16. Despite all that, he was able to stand and fight, which is partly attributed to him, but I think it's a mistake. And I've been wrestling with this idea of Trumpism because as you know, I've written a number of books about Trump, so I have some vested interest in Trumpism. But I think it may be misleading us, and that may be what the red tide is telling us. I saw a headline the other day that I'm trying to work on thinking through, which said that it was the deep state versus the deep nation. And I think there's a lot to that. What you had was, by deep state, I include the billionaires and the internet people and the Chinese communist lovers and all them. You may have noticed that we've already had one of Biden's nominees announce that it's really important that China be successful, which is probably not a concern of most Americans. But in that context, that entire coalition lost ground except at the presidency. And at the presidency, my personal belief as a historian is that they stole the election. I can't prove that as I'm not a lawyer, but you look at all the different anomalies and you put them together, and you just have to reach a conclusion that that they had selected a set of states, and in those states, they were astonishingly hostile.
You talk about the corruption in Philadelphia and things like that. One of the things that I have tried to explain to people, and I know you're familiar over the years with all types of different chicanery that happens in these elections. A lot of the times I try to explain to people, this is not some complex plot. It is not something where you have to engage in convoluted behavior. It can literally be as simple as a box that wasn't there that's suddenly there, or a box that was there that's now gone, and no one can explain what happened to it, or where it went, or whose responsibility it was to watch it. And it's like a natural ecosystem of people who know what to do. There's not like a need to organize this as much as people think, and that makes it very difficult to root out, because campaigns don't have the ability to figure these things out necessarily. And certainly, the Department of Justice, their focus is always on building cases. So it's just a different, I think, animal than a lot of people necessarily understand. Assume, for the sake of argument, that this mail-in balloting approach isn't just something that is going to be a one-off, but that, as a lot of Democrats want, that it becomes something that is a permanent aspect of the American system in 2022 and 2024. What can happen in the interim to give people more confidence in a system that they really need to have confidence in? How do we fix this?
Well, we've had waves like this before. I'm just reading John Barry's book on the influenza of 1918 to 1920. And he has a section there where he talks about why Philadelphia was so unable to deal with it. And he starts by saying Philadelphia in that period was probably the most corrupt city in the country. Back then, by the way, it was a Republican machine, but it's maintained a large part of that same tradition, as has Detroit. So I think you start with the idea if you and Kim Strassel did a great column on this. If you look at what Pelosi introduced as HR1 at the beginning of this Congress, it is a recipe for how to make it easy to steal elections. And in state after state, they in effect implemented it even though it had not passed. And you have to give, for example, Stacey Abrams a lot of credit. She spent 4 years. She raised well over $40 million. She had much better lawyers than the Republicans. She got them to agree to things that are so utterly stupid that you have to wonder. I mean, somebody once said there's a crooked party and a stupid party, and routinely the crooked party beats the stupid party. The Secretary of State in Georgia was absolute proof that he belongs to the stupid party by the things he agreed to. So that we had 1,200,000 absentee ballots, and we are legally prohibited from ascertaining whether or not they're valid by the court agreement that they got back in the spring. I mean, these are things that are insane. Now, as a positive sign, two things. In the short term, 83% of the voters in Pennsylvania in a poll that came out this morning favor dramatic electoral reform. Now, when you get to an 83% issue, and the Republicans control the House and Senate, they don't have the governorship, but you could see this growing into a huge issue by 2022. And I did a newsletter last week at Gingrich 360 where I pointed out that when Clinton was elected, we picked up 53 seats in the first off-year election, or 54 actually. When Obama was elected, we picked up 63 seats in the first off-year election. And my point was, since the Republicans are going to need like 6 seats, what do you think are the odds that in 22 that McCarthy is going to be the speaker? Mm-hmm. Well, I do not think they can rig the election, considering how many of the state legislatures we control. So I think they're not going to be, and particularly if we win the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, I think we'll have relative stasis until we regain momentum, which is why I think it's important to think not about Trumpism, but about Americanism. The Trump was in fact a manifestation of an underlying rebellion that was much bigger than Trump as a person, and that will continue to grow.
Well, one aspect of that where you talk about stasis, and I certainly agree with you on that front. I think, other than spending money, the Congress is unlikely to be able to do anything, assuming that Georgia turns out, in a way that allows Republicans to retain the Senate. Where I do see a significant amount of change and not stasis is a reversal, of course, from the Trump period back to an attempt at an Obama-Biden foreign policy. And you saw that in the naming of a number of different individuals, including, not just Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, but, people like, a Brennan Rice acolyte to be DNI, a number of critical sort of folks within this world coming back into significant roles. John Kerry as a climate expert and the like. What do you see as happening here in terms of a push on foreign policy, given that, clearly the president is trying to cement his record and prevent it from being taken away, a record on Iran and on China and on a number of Middle East related issues that's clearly had some very positive and historic developments. Do you think that Biden's going to be able to roll back a significant part of these things? How much can the blob reassert itself in this instance?
I think it'll be interesting to see whether Biden or Harris has the willpower that Obama had. Obama, for example, was clearly willing to distort everything in the Middle East in order to get a deal with the Iranians. He had this fantasy that he could build a sort of a structure around the Iranians that would allow us to claim a great victory, and he was prepared to do almost anything to achieve it. Whether you get that, whether Biden has that kind of willpower or the people immediately around him, I'm not sure of. Because in a sense, Obama was trying to change reality, whereas these guys are more likely to try to manage reality. So, for example, I doubt very much if they're going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
I mean, for one thing, that would lead to a war with Congress. I think that the Saudis apparently, and I just saw this morning, I assume it's true, but I did not realize it. But apparently the Saudis have been quietly meeting with Netanyahu. And you may well have the Saudis recognizing Israel before Trump leaves office. Well, it's not very likely that the Biden people will actively try to break that up. The problem they're going to have with the Chinese is the same problem that Chamberlain had with Hitler, and that is they can go and be nice to the Chinese, and then they can thank them for all the money they gave Hunter Biden. And they can have one guy they just named today who said that it's it's good for the world if China prospers. But I don't think Xi Jinping can contain himself. So you end up, for example, with Apple, the highest valued company in the world, lobbying against a bill in the Congress that stops the use of slave labor by Uyghurs. Now you have to say to yourself, I mean, there's a certain sickness about multi-billion-dollar corporations and their CEOs who are willing to lobby in favor of slave labor and think that there's no consequence. And so I think what will happen is you'll have an initial burst of weakness in which the Biden people try to appease the Chinese. They will rapidly learn that if they're not careful, this will lead to the Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And they will, I think, then find themselves forced into a series of fights because China is an expansionist power psychologically, actually more than it is an expansionist power in real capabilities. And Xi Jinping thinks a great deal of his domestic survival is a function of this kind of Chinese nationalism expressed on the world stage. The other place that's fascinating, and I have no idea what's going on, is Russia, where there are some indications that Putin actually will be leaving office. They just adopted a constitutional provision that he can't be prosecuted once he leaves office, something which Julius Caesar would have approved of. Mm-hmm. There was some suggestion that he has some health problems, and so you could end up with a Russia that's very different to deal with. And if you look at, Bob Gates, who said, former Secretary of Defense, who said that on every major issue in the last 30 years, Biden had been wrong. He's certainly surrounding himself with the right kind of people to maintain that track record.
I have to correct you. He said 40 years.
40 years. Okay.
40 years.
So if you think about it, the question will be whether there is a domestic cost for those kind of mistakes. And then, the other thing, just talking to you from Italy, I don't think anybody appreciates yet the depth of the damage that has been done to the economies and to the psyches of most of the industrial world. And to the degree to which, one of the great dangers the Democrats face is that Biden could end up as Herbert Hoover, because in the absence of somebody like Trump who actually knows how a free market works, they could make 3 or 4 mistakes, and having come out of the long, slow Obama-Biden semi-recovery, they could tip right back in by next summer to a much deeper recession. And that measured against Trump's achievement would be devastating for the Democratic Party. And I think particularly devastating among Blacks and Latinos.
You've been generous with your time, so I don't want to go overboard, but I am curious about the future of the Republican Party with this new coalition. Do you believe that Republicans can retain the increases among working class Black and Latino Americans that they have achieved under President Trump? And looking backwards, it seems to me like 2020, whatever you take away about the outcome at the presidential level, is really a final rebuttal to the 2012 autopsy report that basically You could have explained it away perhaps in 2016. Again, Hillary Clinton, super unpopular, something like that. But that the performance and the shift that we've seen in terms of the coalition on the right, these are voters that the autopsy was trying to win. They were trying to find a strategy to win. And it turned out that, the approaches that they were suggesting on immigration policy and the like really were not the approaches necessary in order to bring a lot of these more diverse voters into the fold. Can Republicans retain those, and how do they do that?
Well, I mean, I think the party will be in sort of a cheerful level of ferment. You've got, people forget we have the governors of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, and and Maryland. I mean, all of whom are, by any reasonable standard, moderates. You have a very tiny sort of Romney Sass wing of the party, which may in fact be Romney, Sass, and maybe Murkowski. You then have a fair number of people who are traditional conservatives, but who may or may not understand or wish to go down the road Trump was on. And then you have a very large block of younger, newer people who clearly believe that this American party that Trump was creating is the future. I mean, you look at a guy like DeSantis, for example, in Florida, who's, this is the third biggest state in the country. You look at the governor of Texas, second biggest state in the country. These are folks who get it and who are moving in the same direction. The other thing I think that's happened, and here I give McCarthy a lot of credit for having recruited brilliantly, along with Elise Stefanik, who did a great job recruiting women. Most diverse Republican freshman class in history will, I think, be succeeded by an even more diverse class in 2 years, because they're now going to have a pretty easy recruiting job. That's why I wrote the piece on 54 and 63 seats, is to say, you want to get in on the ground floor. Well, for the Republicans, the ground floor is going to be 2022. I think there will be turmoil, but I think there are two things going on. I'm going to be an optimist here. There are two things going on. One is among Blacks and Latinos in particular, or younger people, they're at the end of the road of being told what they're allowed to think. And so we now at Newt's World, where I do my podcast, we now have a whole series of young African-American podcast hosts who are developing their own market, their own style, reaching out to people as conservatives. And it's fascinating to work with them and talk with them, because they represent a profound break from everything that we think of as classically Black politics. The other thing that's going on, I think, is that all the large bureaucracies are finally collapsing. The degree to which the teachers' unions have proven that they couldn't care less about students or education, I think will eventually be historic. The degree to which these systems just can't deliver. I mean, they have arteriosclerosis. They're really creeping, aging, incompetent systems. And so Trump, I always told people, Trump was not a conservative. Trump was the most effective anti-liberal in modern times, and therefore had a conservative effect. But he was closer to William James' concept of pragmatism than he was to any kind of theoretical conservatism. And I think you'll see that growing. And that's why I think whether it's Americanism as opposed to Trumpism, and whether it's based on pragmatism rather than ideological conservatism, does it work? Will it make your life better? Can the current old, obsolete, unionized systems do the job? That may be the future of not just the Republican Party, but the dominant political philosophy of the United States.
So I'll let you go out on this. How are you celebrating Thanksgiving this year?
Well, we have an unusual role because of Callista's job as the ambassador to the Vatican. So every Thanksgiving, she goes in the morning to the American church, which is St. Patrick's, and she reads the president's proclamation. And every afternoon we go to the North American College, which is the Pope's seminary for Americans in Rome, about 400 seminarians. and she reads the proclamation. And at the afternoon event, we get to have Thanksgiving dinner. So it's a very, as long as she's the ambassador, our life on Thanksgiving Day. And then in between, we're going to Zoom with our two daughters in Key Biscayne and in Atlanta.
That's wonderful. All right. Well, happy Thanksgiving to you, sir, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Take care. Thank you.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.